And we have four distinguished speakers. The first is Professor Noel Sharkey of the University of Sheffield, who's the chairman of the International Committee for Robot Arms Control, and he'll be followed by Professor Ron Arkin from the Georgia Institute of Technology. The third speaker will be Wolfgang Richter, who is a retired colonel in the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. And wrapping up will be Professor Julian Kindler, who is an ethicist and is the president of the European Group on Ethics. And when he wraps up, he will have to go quite smartly afterwards. So if you have questions that especially concern ethics, get them in fast, because he won't be available afterwards. He's dashing off to give a plenary lecture. Even better, you could follow him. Okay, Professor Sharkey.
What we're talking about here is lethal autonomous weapons systems. And what we mean by that is a weapon system that, once it's been activated, can operate on its own without further human intervention. And we're not talking about Terminator-style robots here, like Arnold Schwarzenegger in the battlefield, talking about robots that look like jet fighters, trucks, tanks, submarines, and surface vessels. And there are a number of nations that are pretty much heavily into development of these, such as the United States, the UK, Israel, China, Russia, and Taiwan, I believe. And there are probably some more. And at the moment, these weapon systems can use good autonomy, so they can fly around on their own. But my biggest concern is the actual release of the weapons, of the munitions. So the idea that a robot or a robot weapon or an autonomous weapon can actually release the weapon. It can select a target, track a target, select the target, and then kill the target without any human involvement. And people say that that's crossing a fundamental moral line against human dignity and the right to life, to have a machine having the decision to kill you delegated to it. Now, the biggest worry for me, though, is that technologically, we cannot discriminate between civilian and non-civilian objects with these at the moment. We cannot make them be proportionate, and we cannot check the legitimacy of targets using them. So they don't really comply with the laws of war. There have been a lot of technical groups, expert meetings meeting at the UN and at the Chatham House and at the International Committee of the Red Cross, who have all accepted that these things cannot discriminate, be proportionate, or check legitimacy at the moment, and perhaps not for the foreseeable future. So I'm not very optimistic about these, and my concern is that countries are putting billions of dollars into investment, and they're going to use them whether they're like this or not. And there's going to be an arms race which is starting already. And my biggest fear is the full automation of warfare that would ensue. It's very well to talk about my nation will do X or my government will do X, but when every nation has them, every developed nation has them and start using them, then we must be concerned. And just to finish, I'm part of a campaign called the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots, which is a large campaign with 50 NGOs, including Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Oxfam, the Women Nobels Initiative. And we've been taking this to the UN, and it's being discussed at the moment at the CCW at the UN. We're hoping to get them banned.
Thank you very much. Professor Arkin.
Thank you. It's interesting that systems that don't exist clearly won't comply with international humanitarian law if they don't exist yet by some people's definitions. But my fundamental concern here is actually with non-combatants. The status quo with respect to non-combatant casualties in the battlefield is utterly and wholly unacceptable. Technology can, should, and must be put to use to better protect civilian lives. One of the ways in which I believe that this can be done is through the advent of lethal autonomous weapon systems, which can potentially outperform human warfighters with respect to ethical performance in the battlefield, resulting in fewer non-combatant casualties, and hence a moral imperative to use these systems if, and this is the big if we can create them as such. Research into this particular area is something I advocate. The call for a ban by Human Rights Watch and Article 36 and the International Committee of Robots Arms Control is a bit premature to me. I advocate a moratorium until we can fundamentally demonstrate that these capabilities are here. One of the biggest problems we have, which we saw at the UN and the ICRC meetings, is definitions. We don't agree on what autonomy means. We don't agree on what meaningful human control means. Everyone wants meaningful human control. Why would you create a robot that doesn't have meaningful human control? What would that be? Well, that would be a Terminator, right? No one wants a Terminator. We want robots that can be controlled, but the real question is at what is the appropriate level and what does that mean? I advocate that we can do this with systems that will not be perfectly ethical. They will make mistakes, but if they make fewer mistakes than human beings do, to me, again, that argues for their usage, and they should be used in very narrow, bounded circumstances. We do not need to replicate sentience. We do not need to replicate moral agency. We need to be able to, or all the moral faculties of a human being, we need to be able to put constraints on these, governors, muzzles, if you will, to ensure that they restrict themselves appropriately under the set of circumstances so they comply with international humanitarian law. And if they don't comply with international humanitarian law, obviously they're illegal. It's as simple as that. So how could they get in the battlefield? So the real question is, does international humanitarian law have to be supplemented with new means, such as through the CCW that Noel was talking about, or can existing IHL cover that? It hasn't been demonstrated to me that it's yet adequate. And I think those are my main points. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Colonel Richter.
Yeah, thank you. We discussed the question whether robots would be the more ethical soldiers. That was, of course, a provocation. And both of the contradicting answers we just heard focus particularly on close combat situations which allow a direct comparison of soldiers acting under battle stress and with more machines operating without emotions. Let me give you 6 basic points on that. First, autonomous weapon systems do not take decisions in the sense of human cognitive intelligence, but execute program functions and under certain conditions which are decided and controlled by humans. So these systems do not have any independent ability to act ethically, which could be compared to human beings. Second, while human emotions are important factors in close combat situations, they have little relevance in modern war fighting, conventional war, which is dominated by remote targeting and far-range firing against military hardware. That applies also to most functions of the perceived autonomous weapon systems. Third, autonomous weapon systems do not act independently from human control. The discussion on meaningful human control cannot be narrowed down to technical guidance methods of single weapon systems, but has to consider their integration in the overall design of military operations. This is what the humanitarian law regulates. The deployment of weapons, of such weapon systems, does not replace command and control and will depend on varying battlefield conditions. Commanders remain responsible and accountable for the effects of their operational concept and control of execution, no matter which weapon system they use. Fourth, autonomous weapon systems will assist combat teams in reducing their burdens and risks gradually, improving their survivability, carrying out multiple tasks in complex situations with lesser personnel. But they will neither fully replace the soldier on the battlefield nor eliminate the political, military, and individual risks of war. Fifth, for the ethical and legal debate, it is paramount to distinguish between strikes against military hardware targets as opposed to lethal attacks against individuals and groups of human beings. The latter could pose high risk to the ability of commanders to comply with legal, political, and military constraints and limitations in a complex operational environment. And sixth and last, the political discussion on how to regulate development, acquisition, and the use of autonomous weapon systems should distinguish between automated systems that have been fielded already and fully autonomous systems which are subject to research. In order to prevent destabilizing effects on international security, appropriate transparency in arms control measures should be considered. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Professor Candelera.
Good morning. I'm an observer here. I am president of the European Group on Ethics, reporting to the European Commission, Council, and Parliament on ethical issues which are referred to us or on which we choose to act. That group was asked by President Barroso just over 2 years ago to look at security and surveillance in the European Union and to comment on the ethics of that. well before Snowden came out, so it's been an interesting few months working on that. We obviously addressed drones and addressed autonomous weapons at the same time when looking at these issues. And I've been fascinated by the discussion that I've heard today. These autonomous weapons are weapons. They have human operators, or the decisions that in the manner in which they're used are made by humans. Can we trust those humans? Can we trust the algorithms which are used to define what and when they are used? There's a presumption in the meeting we had earlier that they would only be used in high-pressure war situations. Have we ever seen a weapon developed which is not used? And it's not used in any context? I think the answer is no. So we must assume they will be used for riot control in the near future, if they've developed, let alone for war, unless we have some mechanism of controlling them. And that would have to be international. So I don't believe we can say they'll only be used for major war. I don't believe we can say that they are subject to international law, because I've watched in my lifetime war happening all over the world, from Europe to Rwanda to South Africa. And I just don't believe that the control of weaponry is normally in accordance with international law and being harsh. And if that's the case, then these weapons will be used, and they will be used in circumstances which we didn't plan for. Can ethics address that issue? It has to. It has to, and it means, as Noel said earlier, that we have to find a way to ensure that there is an international cooperation, to assure that the manner in which these weapons are controlled and used, if at all, is identified in international law, and if used inappropriately, there are methods for the international community to say that was unacceptable. And until that time, we should not allow their use.
Thank you very much. Some very large questions have been raised there. Can I just remind you, before you put your hands up, that there's a roving microphone, and it would be, because this is being recorded, I'd be ever so grateful if you'd say who you are. Do you have any questions?
Thank you. Manuel Lino from El Economista, Mexico. Well, I attended from the session, and I noticed that there was a very, it was a very logical discussion, and not a very ethical one. Could we comment, particularly Colonel Richter and Professor Ron Arkin, their ethical position, not their logical position, because there is too much logic in this, and it's supposed to be an ethical position. What is your ethical position?
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you for asking that question. In my position, there are two ethical frameworks in play. One is deontology, which speaks to the right to life as the fundamental human right, and human rights law speaks to this as well too. To me, the right to life regarding a non-combatant trumps many of the other issues associated with, as Noel spoke of earlier, the right to a dignified death and other things of that. So that also switches over to a utilitarian or consequentialist framework, an ethical framework, which deals with the measurement of saved lives. In other words, the moral imperative arises when we can show, just as we've shown with precision-guided munitions, GBUs, guided bomb units and the like as well too. We can effectively reduce collateral damage through the use of those weapons when they're in their arsenal, and Human Rights Watch has argued that there is a moral imperative to use them under those circumstances. Not that they want bombs to be dropped, obviously not. But if you're going to drop bombs, you better drop more precise bombs to better protect civilians. My contention is that if we can create lethal autonomous weapon systems that are more proportional, more discriminate, safer, don't do shoot first, ask questions later, but rather first do no harm in the context of maintaining adequate security and certainty regarding the targets and ensuring that non-combatant safety is treasured better than than human warfighters are capable of doing currently, then I would contend that there is a moral imperative to do so from a utilitarian basis.
Also, thank you for the question. I think we have to balance two ethical problems here, and it comes back to the question to what extent war is justified and legal. So, on the one hand, you have the right to defense of your nation, of your people, which is enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations, under certain conditions, until the UN Security Council acts. This is the one point. But all armies probably have the to obey the rule that they are there for defending their people, basically. Secondly, if you do that, you are not, as the international humanitarian law stipulates, you are not free to use unlimited force. The force has to be measured. And there are, I'll just give you 3 or 4 basic rules. The responsibility of commanders would state. There's always one who should be accountable for the. The second is a distinction rule. That means no military operations is allowed to be designed to directly target civilians or civilian objects. And third, there's a proportionality rule, which means the military advantage gained by operations should be in some proportion to the collateral damage they might cause. And that leads me to the fourth point, which is the commanders are responsible for taking precautionary measures in that kind of operations. So whatever I say boils down to the question of military operations that should be in line with the stipulations of the international humanitarian law. In other words, you cannot narrow down the question of ethical behaviors to a technical guidance system for certain weapon systems. Weapons are an integral part of military operations. They might be used under certain circumstances, and they are not allowed to be used under other circumstances. And this is particularly true in very cluttered situations, let's say in urban terrain or in asymmetrical warfare, where you have hard time to distinguish between soldiers, combatants, also combatant-like armed groups, and other groups that might carry weapons, like police, own forces, of course, and allies, and so on. In these cluttered situations, I think it's irresponsible, it would be irresponsible to use that kind of weapons, but there might be other situations, and we had the same rule applied already in the past. Think of a multiple rocket launcher. A multiple rocket launcher cannot, it delivers area fire, just to clarify. That cannot be used, for example, against a city in which the population still lives. But it might be used against, in high-intensity warfare, against tank columns executing a mass attack. So you always have to distinguish and don't narrow down the question of ethics and international humanitarian law to one single weapon systems. There are exceptions in international humanitarian law where the weapon system, by the very design, cannot comply with the basic rules I just have given, no matter what you do, which precautionary measures you take in designing the operation. These weapons are prohibited or they are constrained by 5 protocols of the UN CCW Convention. In all other cases, the international humanitarian law applies on the military operations as such, and the commanders stay responsible.
Thank you very much, Professor Sharkey.
Just make a short comment. What Colonel Richter is talking about international humanitarian law, and he's talking about using these robots in a very narrowly constrained way, in a way that would be militarily acceptable. But unfortunately, he and the Germans would have no say in how they were actually used when they get out in the real world. But I wanted to point out ethically that there is a distinction which is not being made here, between the laws of war and ethics. The laws of war are not necessarily ethical at all. They're partly. What it is they're trying to, the Geneva Conventions was trying to capture the moral aptitude of the various nations and classify them into the laws of war. But now that we've got the laws of war, I spend a lot of time with rooms full of international humanitarian lawyers, and it turns war into, while I think that we should have laws of war, of course we have to, but it turns war into a kind of legitimizes it and turns it into a kind of game where you have lawyers looking for loopholes and saying, oh, you could do this, or you could do X, or you could have killed Y if they were carrying a gun or they had something else. So the laws of war sort of capture a bit of ethical behavior, but not completely. And the other thing was, you heard Professor Arkin saying several times, if we could do this, then it would be better. If they could be more precise, if they could be more ethical. But it's an if. I mean, if I could dig a hole through the planet at the moment from here and insulate it properly, we would have a very good method of transport to Australia that would be very fast. But it's unlikely. And so I have no evidence that these ifs will come into being. And in the meantime, nations are rushing to develop these weapons very rapidly, and they will not necessarily be used in an ethical way. I mean, I've never seen warfare being particularly ethical ever.
Can I ask, oh, sorry, lots of questions. Can I ask the panel very quickly, how long have we talked? Yeah. Yes, is this a 2-year problem, a 5-year problem? How long before we have a fully autonomous?
I'll answer that. He's asking how long before we have fully autonomous weapons. We could have fully autonomous weapons tomorrow. Simple as that. Well, maybe not tomorrow, but maybe next week. I can make you one. My students have made them. They fire paintballs at people. You just use a pair of sensors that detect someone and fire at them. I could use household alarm sensors that are heat motion detectors, and I could have a robot come into this room and kill all the people but not damage the furniture particularly. Okay, so, but the problem with that, it's completely indiscriminate, and there's no nation that would stand up at the moment and say, there might be terrorist groups or you know, all sorts of dictators who might use those, but at the moment there's no nations that would use them. How long till we can do discrimination? How long's a piece of string? I don't know. We've been working very hard on it for 40 years, and at the moment we're at the level where you can tell if something is a tank in an empty desert, if it's a completely uncluttered environment in the way that Colonel Richter's talking about, or you can tell that something's a ship in the middle of the ocean. But so the rest is actually speculation. We don't know.
Quick answer to your question. You are provoking me, of course, I could answer. But to your question, that's why I said at the beginning we should differentiate between automated systems and autonomous weapon systems. We had a long discussion, as Professor Arkin rightly pointed out, in Geneva about the differences. We could not agree on definitions. But in my view, automated systems carry out simple or less complex, let's say, linear functions against a simple environment, with situation, mode of operation, targeting, firing of weapons, and so on, precisely predefined by design and specified by the operator. And the main thing is these weapons exist already. They are fielded. Autonomous weapon, fully autonomous weapon systems are capable of executing more complex tasks in more complex circumstances, and they can adapt. That is at least the expectation. Their operation to a changing environment and choose an optimum mix of movement, target selection, time, and mode of attack in accordance with priority rules, which are still designed by and specified by the operator, defined by design and specified by the operator. So that might be a step-by-step development. It is, of course, very difficult to draw the exact line, but we should still, for practical reasons and for negotiating international instruments, try to come up with definitions and make a clear difference between the weapons that are in existence. And I would ask you whether it is unethical, let me just at least make this one point, unethical to use robotic systems in a situation in which inferior numbers would have to defend against a mass attack, let's say at a river line, and you have a robot in the fog of war when there is smoke screens and so on, and you try to select the bridge layers first and then shoot the tanks and finally the APCs. And this is the kind of functions an autonomous weapon system could make or would make, at least this is the expectation. That means according to priority rules which are decided by humans. So there is no independent ethical behavior of robots, but they follow certain functions which are pre-designed. Yeah, I don't find that unethical to use that kind of weapons in these circumstances. It depends on the circumstances, and for that the commander stays responsible.
Before Professor Sharkey comes back, Ron Arkin.
Yes, thank you. I agree with Professor Sharkey that legal does not equal moral. There's an important distinction here. Weapons are now shown to comply with international humanitarian law. It doesn't necessarily make them ethically appropriate. One of the reasons why I support the moratorium as opposed to a ban. But regarding when these systems will be created, we already have IHL-approved lethal autonomous weapon systems deployed. They've been around for 30 years or more. The Aegis-class cruisers have a self-defense system, which is typified by the Phalanx system, which, if you go to the Navy webpage, will tell you it autonomously tracks, designates, engages, and does battle damage assessment on a particular target, self-proclaimed as an autonomous weapon system. There are others as well, too, and I presume, although I'm not sure, the Harpy system for Israel has been shown to be IHL compliant as it's been sold internationally, and a variety of other fire and forget munitions which have existed for some time. Autonomy is very, and this is important for the press to understand. There's different definitions for autonomy. There's the philosophical sense, which is sentience and moral agency and culpability if something goes wrong. No one in the military is talking about that. Philosophers are talking about that. What we are talking about is the ability to track, engage, and potentially destroy and evaluate a particular target. In other words, basically autonomy equates to Foss's definition, which is the ability to pull the trigger without asking a human being, should I be able to do that? Landmines have done that. Sophisticated anti-tank mines have done that using seismic signatures and infrared signatures and have been shown to be compliant with IHL because they do the discrimination. Now, doing it in cluttered situations, as you were saying, with humans is incredibly hard. And many of the pictures that Dr. Sharkey has shown with children with water guns and the like are not likely to be found in high-intensity combat sets of circumstances. And as you probably are well aware, you can always create a philosophical paradox where a system will have difficulty making that assessment. From my point of view, the system that does better, whether it be robotic or human, is ultimately the better choice to use with respect to protection of non-combatant casualties. And one last point to perhaps refute, apart from our discussion which we had with engaging individual targets crossing the demilitarized zone should the North Korean Army perhaps, or the South Korean Army, take your pick, decide to cross over there. There are robots that have been deployed there which do have an auto mode operation to be able to engage targets in an area which is already declared war. There is a military demarcation line which crosses through that. If you cross over that line, you can be shot. It's as simple as that. It says it everywhere that you can be shot. Tell civilians, stay out of here. You can be shot. Is it inappropriate to have robots under those sets of circumstances? Is it unethical to have them under those circumstances? I don't think so if they can perform as well as a human. They also have manual modes for individuals that might be crossing so they can intervene. It doesn't automatically shoot everything that it sees, but if a mass attack does occur. And finally, one important scenario came up when I was having discussions with a military JAG lawyer, Judge Advocate General lawyer that was in field in Afghanistan. And he was telling me about when I was saying you should not use these in counterinsurgency operations. That has always been my position. Well, he said not so fast to me. And he came up with this particular case, which was at military checkpoints, where cars sometimes are often rushing towards a barricade which is present there, and the soldiers behind it are told the rules of engagement are basically to stop the vehicle, not kill the occupants, but to stop the vehicle by shooting out the engine or the tires or what have you. He said his soldiers tended to aim high, unfortunately, which is not a surprise when you might think a high explosive car is coming towards you, and a significant number, I believe they never found a case, I better not say that because that would be anecdotal, but they tended to aim high. Could we create a robotic system that could be better at targeting these particular things from a stationary platform if it was hurtling at a high speed and unchecked and suitably warned? I think so. I think that's within the range of capabilities right now. And I don't know if you would call that within a military vehicle or not, but the point is, the key factor is, could it afford better protection for civilians? It warrants research. I agree with Noel also that these are ifs, but we have to be able to do the research to determine if those ifs hold.
Very quickly, Noel, the question is here.
I will be very quick. One thing is that you do know that the moratorium that Christoph Haynes, the Special Rapporteur for Extrajudicial Killings, is also on testing of these devices. So it means you couldn't really find out what you were trying to find out. He's calling for a moratorium until nations will discuss it and work out the rules.
There's a questioner here. There were 2 or 3 of you there. Who wants to go first? Okay. And then right behind you.
Yeah. Thank you. Ilgans Wilks, Popular Science magazine, Terra. When using these autonomous systems, what are the main risks you see? Let's say, what can go wrong?
That could keep us busy for some time.
About everything, really.
Yeah.
At the moment, my biggest concern at the moment is that, by definition, fully autonomous. Now, we must separate out what Colonel Richter's saying from fully autonomous weapons. There's a problem at the moment that a lot of systems are already being used to shoot down munitions, to shoot down missiles. For instance, the Iron Dome system, a lot of American aircraft use fire and forget missiles. They have very good radiation detection sensors, so the person looks to see what's there. It's called supervised autonomy, the US military call it, where there's someone there, like the Phalanx system that shoots down. They have, Germany have a system called the Mantis that shoots down mortar munitions. So those systems seem to be okay because they're shooting down military objects, and we should separate those from the notion of fully autonomous weapons. I forgot what his question was now.
What could go wrong?
Yeah.
Oh, the dangers, right. Okay. So when we get away from those systems, the biggest danger for me is really the unpredictability of autonomy and the ability to be able to test it. There's no formal method. I mean, in computer science, we have one of the biggest formal testing groups in Europe, and we can probably, and we've been going for about 30 years on this, you could formally test a computer system providing it's no more than about 12 lines of computer code. So there is no way of really formally testing an autonomous system. Autonomy means that it's probabilistic or stochastic, which means it's unpredictable. But that might just be it's unpredictable in small behaviors rather than its overall behavior. That's what you need to look at. So how do you test these systems? Well, you would have to test them by empirical means. You'd have to run them, you'd have to test them by seeing how they do. But there's an infinite number of circumstances that can occur in warfare that you couldn't have thought of. You've got an adaptive enemy, you've got an enemy who can game the technology, who can make it do all sorts of things. I can easily make a robot do all sorts of things that the person never intended to do. That's one of my fun things I do. So you can game the technology quite easily. If you're a sniper, for instance, you can set off a firework among civilians and it would just kill them because there's no way of telling the difference. So those are the real worries, is the unpredictability. And I think that that's a real worry for the military when you're using it, when you're doing an Article 36 review. The United States is a big technology nation, and they might say, well, we'll run it, 1,000 tests and simulation, etc. But we're talking about many nations using these. Some of them don't even do reviews or adequate reviews.
I know this is a big subject, but it needs short answers because we're running out of time.
This will be a very short answer. Noel, you have to be careful flying home because you're getting into an autonomous aircraft, basically. Yeah. And someone may not have done the appropriate verification on your Lyapunov stability. You're not getting into, okay, you're walking home.
No, I'm not getting into an autonomous aircraft.
Yes, well, they're basically autonomous. You talked about, there's a human being. I just spoke to the pilot sitting next to me. They take off, they fly, they can land. There is a human there.
Let me make a difference between the autonomy of cruise control and the autonomy of targeting and selecting and releasing weapons. So, that's a difference, and of course we should have that in mind. The question was, what could go wrong? I would ask the question, what could go wrong in war? War as such is unpredictable. The belief that war could be shaped to be clean without any collateral damage is an illusion, whatever you do. Finally, the responsibility for restraint operations lies with the commander, and it doesn't lie with the use of certain weapon systems, because under some circumstances you can use these weapon systems. I gave you some examples before, and in other circumstances you cannot. That means if you have a sea or air environment relatively uncluttered, it is easier to use that kind of weapons. when you try to deny access to key terrain in high-intensity battles, there might be use for robots as well, beyond the defense against rockets, for example, Mantis or whatever you said. So we have to have the right conditions in place. I could imagine the use of autonomous weapon systems in a limited time and space with limited targeting, pre-designed by the operation team and ordered by the commander. The question really is whether in that kind of war, which is always unpredictable, and finally the human beings are unpredictable, as you rightly pointed out, the question is whether we could design an interface between robotic and human beings so that we use the best functions or advantages of both to help make the war a little bit more, whatever, humane, this may be the wrong expression, to avoid further dehumanization of war, let's say this way. And if we can find out that, we all would probably be happy. And that is why I personally am not in favor of a right-out ban across the board for all autonomous weapons for the future, but I would maybe be in line with you asking for a moratorium for fully autonomous weapons. And finally, I would add that that kind of weapons can, of course, also have destabilizing effects on the international security because it could undermine existing confidence-building measures and arms control treaties. And that's why we have to look at this point as well and make sure that transparency is in place. And maybe we need to look at the Conventional Armed Forces Treaty in Europe. Maybe we need to change a little bit the definitions there or have the better understanding of the definitions to include, for example, drones, which could maybe in future fly in a fully autonomous way.
Just one 2-second point. What you just said is I agree with entirely. You can use the best of computing and the best of humanity with deliberative reasoning, but then you're not supporting an autonomous weapon. If the human is in control and making the decision to apply lethal force, that is not a fully autonomous weapon. And I agree entirely with what you said, that that would be the best way. And it could be more humane than humanity.
We have time for one last question, as short as possible, and the answers need to be as short as possible too.
Hi, I'm Christine Delamore from National Geographic. A lot of the things you've been talking about are abstract, but to write about it, I need some specifics. So I was wondering if you could quickly outline a few specific instruments or programs that are close to being developed.
Yeah, yes. Can we limit that to what is going to be the first to happen to hit us?
Okay, I'll just give you some. You write them down quickly. You can Google them. There's the X-47B, which is a fully autonomous fighter aircraft that's been developed in the United States. It's been tested quite to advanced level, and that's going to be replaced by UCLASS, UCLASS, and maybe there's no L in there. There's the Crusher by DARPA, which is a 7.5-ton truck. There's another DARPA program, Defence Advanced Research Projects Agency, on autonomous submarines. There's the UK fully autonomous intercontinental combat aircraft that's been tested this year in Australia, looking out to acquire targets, although the UK aren't going to let it do that. And that's called the Taranis, T-A-R-A-N-I-S. There's also the Russian one that you just mentioned, which is the Robot Jeep, but I can't remember what. I don't think they've got a name for it, yeah. But there's a lot of them online. If you look through Boeing and those companies, you'll find. Russians have the SCAT. The Chinese have the Anjan, A-N-J-A-I-N, or it might be I-A-N, which is the invisible sword. That's an air-to-air combat aircraft. I don't know if you want to add any more.
I would also put a caveat on that. Those are not fully autonomous weapon systems, so they could be. That's the interesting thing. If you even look at a Reaper right now, a fully autonomous Reaper versus a human-controlled Reaper would look essentially the same. The only thing difference would be the actual way the processing goes on board. Imagine, for example, you were conducting a deep strike mission into a particular area against a sophisticated enemy. What if they use countermeasures, radio jamming, spoofing, or what have you? The link went down back all the way to 6,000 miles across the planet. What is that, again, a sophisticated enemy, what is that Reaper going to do? Is it going to circle around and wait to reacquire? Is it going to go back home? Or is it going to be given sufficient autonomy to continue its mission on its own? I don't believe that has been done yet, but I believe that's in the near future.
On that note, I'm going to bring the press conference to a close. Professor Candelera actually has to go and give a plenary lecture now. So I would ask you to let the speakers get off the platform, and I'd ask you too to thank them very much for one of the most stimulating press conferences I've ever attended.